work for an organization called the Renewable Energy Alaska Project, and we work as within a role that's called a regional partner for the Energy Transitions Initiative Partnership Project. And all that is just a really fancy way of saying that it's a mechanism that the federal government can fund community-based technical assistance for renewable energy projects. And the recognition is that if you're going to do community-based work, you can't have a bunch of people that are based in Colorado telling people in Alaska how they should design their systems. It just doesn't work very well. So I'm based in Anchorage. I grew up in Fairbanks, and I have spent the last 15 years traveling to every corner of this state, slept in floors, gyms, science classrooms, you name it, been there, all in the name of service to small communities. In McGrath, we have a cool project where we are trying to help the community to achieve some of your energy goals. And we have 3 steps, 3 major tasks in that particular project. The first task is to develop a community energy plan. And we're doing that with fine folks such as yourselves. The second task is there to inform the first task, which is a community education plan. Haley is from REAP, is the primary person that's responsible for coordinating all that, and she'll talk about some additional steps down the road. But suffice it to say that everything that we're trying to do in terms of a resource assessment and community energy plan really hinges on you as community members being able to make informed choice. And the second, so that's what the education plan is for. Which is which is our second task, and then the third task is a renewable energy assessment. That work has been ongoing. So is the community energy planning, but we've actually put a pause on that just because we really need to catch up on education. And our plan is to spend something on the order of about the next 6 months talking about best practices for community energy planning and to just try and fill some gaps. And that's where Colleen Fisk comes in. Colleen directs our science, technology, energy, and mathematics group at REAP. Most of what she does is providing direction to a team of STEM educators, but she also works quite a bit with teachers and with students. And rather than have me as a non-professional educator start talking about energy, we thought, why not go find somebody who does this all day, every day? And so what we'll have is we'll have Colleen step in and take us through that process. It looks like my colleague Tyler Katzmar is also joining us. Haley will talk somewhat about Tyler's involvement moving forward, but the way that I think of Tyler and Tyler's involvement is he's the person that has this hands-on approach, and he'll be the one working with technology and demonstrations of technology, hopefully in the latter part of the summer. So that's all of us there. And my colleague Clay Good has joined us as well. Clay is also a STEM educator based out of Southeast Alaska, and he also is a regional catalyst for an organization called the Sustainable Southeast Partnership. So he's like, this is what he does, and so we're thrilled to have him along. So if you're okay with that, if introductions have been enough, I will shut up and let Colleen go do some good work.
Great, thank you. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Colleen Fisk. I am the Education Director at REAP, And I grew up in Wasilla, outside Wasilla, lived in Anchorage for some years, but now I'm back to living not far from where I grew up. And so today I have a slideshow that I'm gonna show. We sent Sarah a print-friendly version of this earlier that didn't have a bunch of the images and stuff on it today. So I don't know if you guys have print copies of that as well. There's only minor changes from that. But hopefully you guys are hearing us okay so far. I know we did a quick check earlier, but everything's sounding all right so far. Yeah. Okay, so, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and start my slideshow then. And we will do most of our questions at the end, but if you do have kind of a burning question or something I said doesn't make sense that you kind of need to know before we keep moving on, then you can put that in the chat, or Sarah can put that in the chat for us. But we'll also have time at the end for plenty of discussion. We have about 25 slides here, and some of those are just like title slides. So I don't want to spend a ton of time just talking at you. I want to make sure that we're having discussion and questions. And so I'm going to see if I can pull up the participant video so I can see you guys. That always helps me be able to see things going on a little bit better if I could see you guys. Okay, there we go. Yeah, but I have the chat pulled up and I'm going to talk through some of the stuff here. So our topic today is talking about electric grids. And yep, Rob's watching in the chat. Unfortunately, we've got some great experts who are here on Zoom with me to be able to help out with this. All right, so our topic today, electric grids. But briefly, I just want to talk about who it is that we work for. We have 4 of the REAP staff here, including myself, online, and we're a nonprofit organization that does work across the state, trying to facilitate increased renewable energy and energy efficiency in Alaska through those 4 things listed there on the screen. Of course, my focus is in education. Like Rob said, I do a lot of K through 12 education, teacher trainings, and I help coordinate with the other educators that we have on staff who are both here with us as well. And we get funding from a variety of places and groups. Most of my job is funded from Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. We also have funding from Office of Naval Research, Department of Energy, like with the ETIPP project that Rob mentioned, private donors. It's kind of this whole slew of places where we get our funding as a nonprofit to be able to do this work. And I also want to acknowledge that I myself grew up and continue to live and work on Dina lands. And as we're thinking about our energy use, I really like to make sure that I'm stepping back and keeping this in perspective, that there have been people who've been living here for thousands of years and stewarding these lands, especially as we're thinking about energy and resources. And so I like to make sure that I'm keeping that in my mind as well whenever I'm talking about energy. So an outline for today, I think you guys probably saw kind of the topics that we wanted to cover, and I've broken it down into these 4 areas where I just give an introduction to electrical grids, talk about the basics of what a microgrid is as a type of electrical grid, and then some clean energy technologies, a tiny bit on efficiency. We'll talk about some renewables technologies and a little bit on electrification and storage. And then we'll kind of wrap up with further learning and next steps. And Haley will talk about that at the end as well, about the things that REAP is going to be continuing to work with on McGrath over the next 6 months. So let's dive into it. What is this grid? So the grid is kind of this term that people use that really means this wide area system connecting electricity producers to electricity consumers. So electricity producers, we typically think about as a utility, a power plant, but could also be other types of renewables that are integrated in. And then to the consumers, to the homes, the schools, the businesses that are using the electricity. And it is a system, right? When we're talking about a grid, there's many different components I'll talk about here. And the goals, make sure I'm not missing a question. Okay. And then grid, they think about, when you're thinking about the grid, they have some technical goals that they're thinking about when they want to make sure they have an efficient grid. And a working grid is they want to make sure they're maintaining frequency, maintaining reliability, and ensuring that the supply or that production of electricity is meeting the demand or that use of the electricity. So some of the components that go into a grid is starting out with a generation, right? So this could be a power station, a power plant that uses diesel or, like where I live, natural gas, and they're turning that into electrical energy. And then it needs to be moved to wherever that is. And so here where I live, Wasilla, we have big transmission lines that carry this power, this electricity to substations. So a substation is something that steps down the voltage to a usable level. And then they go through a distribution line, so smaller lines, and then get stepped down again at another substation to where it can actually be used or consumed. Now, microgrids almost usually don't have transmission lines. They just have the distribution side of it. They don't have the big high voltage lines, but the same sort of process is still, as you're thinking about this, it's still the same basic components of generation, moving it through transmission and or distribution, and then consumption of being used by different people and buildings. And there's kind of a key component here that we want to think about is that generation depends on consumption. So the way that our grids work is that the utilities or whoever's managing that grid is estimating how much electricity has to be used, and then they generate based on that. And then as they see any increase or decrease in that usage, they change how much they produce to meet that. And so that's called load following, because it follows whatever that load, that consumption, that use is. And so this is an example of someplace like in a hot area, maybe not Alaska, of how much electricity is used on a normal day following this red line. But if there's like a hot summer day where a lot of people are using air conditioning, they would use a lot more. And so that's something that the utilities using software would help predict that, oh, okay, we see that there's going to be a hot day, more people are going to be using air conditioning. We know this from experience that there will be more that's there. And so they can plan for that. But of course, sometimes there are things that they can't plan. And so that can cause some difficulty. The smaller the grid, the more difficult that is to be able to follow that load. And so I do want to have a couple of definitions here and make sure that we're all on the same page. So if I'm saying words that I'm not, we're all on the same page for what I mean. And so load following, which I kind of described already, that increase or decreasing that electricity generation based on that load. And then we talk about different resources here soon. We're talking about a dispatchable resource as some sort of energy source, like a power plant, a generator, whatever it is, that can be turned on or off, dispatched, when the grid operators want to use it. And so this can be either renewable or non-renewable, like a fossil fuel based. And so there are some renewables that are considered dispatchable, like some hydroelectric storage and geothermal. But then there's the non-dispatchable resources that can't be turned on and off or adjusted to meet that grid demand. And so those are the ones that we typically think of, like wind and solar. And because of how we follow the load in an electric grid system, that's part of what makes it difficult sometimes to integrate those non-dispatchable resources. All right, so this is a balancing act, right? Any type of grid that you have has to balance these different pieces of a grid. And it uses, what we use is alternating current. And what that just means, if you want the science of it, is that the voltage changes directions periodically. It's every 60 times in 1 second, it changes. And that's why we have, if you've heard of 60 hertz, it's because it changes 60 times in that 1 second. And that's called that frequency. And so the utilities have to make sure that they are maintaining that frequency. Otherwise, if it goes too far outside of that frequency is when you start having brownouts, blackouts, burnout appliances, that sort of thing. And that frequency is dependent on the grid being able to match whatever is being used. Now, typically, you don't call up the utility and say, hey, I'm going to turn on a big appliance. I'm going to plug in a freezer, or I'm going to turn on my computer or turn off my lights or whatever that is, right? And so they are just having to make those guesses. And if a big event happens, or if a bunch of events together combine, that's when you can have an effect on the grid, because that frequency is not maintained, because it's not kept within that narrow range. And so that's why that generation has to match or even slightly overcalculate for it so that they are ready for any changes, surges one way or the other. So modern grids must be smooth operators. A lot of times on larger, you'll see that they have sophisticated software systems that manage this, because these things happen in such fractions of a second. You're not able to take care of that. A person can't do that on their own. And so that's where you have these software systems that make that happen. And so the way that this is, SCADA is just one example of that, supervisory control and data acquisition. SCADA is one type of way that is done. And this helps a grid become more resilient. So a grid's resiliency depends on part as well on how redundancies are built in. There's always going to be faults or issues that happen. And so anytime you can have redundancy, such as power lines to more than one, like in a concentrated area, you have a lot of people living in one area, you don't have just one power line going there, you have more than one. You have the substations have different pieces to it that can help build that in. The software has fail safes that help protect things, right? And so all of those redundancies help create that resiliency. And that's especially important when you're combining dispatchable and non-dispatchable resources. So dispatchable being something like diesel, non-dispatchable being something like solar. And so in Alaska, what we have for grids is we have kind of this main grid that we call the rail belt, because it roughly follows the railroad from Fairbanks and down to Seward and Homer. And then, and those are the only ones that are connected on a larger electrical grid. And then the rest of the communities in the state are connected in what are considered microgrids. And so I'll talk more about what those microgrids are. But this is a map that shows you that connection from Fairbanks, followed on down. And there is a Renewable Energy Atlas of Alaska that has these you can download for free online. So if you want to look at this in more detail, it's got some cool maps in there looking at energy. You can download that for free as well. So those are our introduction basics to electrical grids. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about microgrids specifically because, of course, McGrath is on a microgrid. So some of this content that I pulled, I also, and I should say in general, the resources that I pulled, this isn't like stuff that I just created myself. A lot of times I'm pulling resources from other either videos or informational programs, including Alaska Center for Energy and Power has a lot of information. They have an online course I'll talk about more later. So anytime you see that ACEP logo, you'll see that's where I'm pulling a lot of information from them. And I did try to put, sources for all of my information and almost all of my images, and it's also in the notes section of the PowerPoint files. So if you guys want to learn more about this, I tried to put those sources there so that you can kind of explore and learn more yourself as well. So, microgrids. So microgrids can mean a lot of things. basically, microgrids are ones that are disconnected or can be disconnected from a larger grid. So in Alaska, pretty much everything outside of our rail belt system is considered a microgrid because they are in one geographic area. In the lower 48 and in other places, a microgrid is often considered something that can be disconnected from the larger grid or can run on its own when there is some sort of power outage. So of course, we're going to focus more on what is applicable in Alaska and for McGrath. But just so you know that a microgrid definition has these 5 attributes that are defined by ETIPP here. So this local generation, often from renewables, a network of distribution lines. So it's not just one customer or one building. You have multiple customers or end users, and they're in generally one geographic area, such as a military base or a community, smaller community. And there is some sort of control system so that it can operate from a larger grid, like I mentioned. So that's kind of that overarching definition of microgrids. Can mean a lot of different things, but because Alaska actually has 12% of the world's microgrids, and so this is something that people are looking at a lot and seeing how they are working in Alaska and what lessons they can learn from Alaska microgrids to apply it to other places in the world. Because microgrids can provide a lot of benefits, right? They can help if in a larger area, if you have power outage from one place, you can pull from something else. You can have more grid resiliency. So in major events that you have that backup. And microgrids are really ripe for renewables, for being able to transition at least some off of fossil fuels. And renewables, when you add them to a microgrid, can increase that grid resiliency, like I've said. They can also help stabilize electricity costs because your costs are stable. They tend to be known for what those maintenance costs are, and you don't have fluctuating fuel costs. You have, of course, the ideal, if they're put on correctly, is decreasing that imported fossil fuel use, and that there's a lot of funding that's coming from some funding from the state and a lot from the federal government for grants and other aid like rebates to be able to put renewables on individuals or community systems. Of course, there are some barriers, right? It's not all sunshine and roses. It's not something easy necessarily to happen because many microgrids need to be modernized. They're not ready for some of these challenges associated with renewables. Sometimes you need storage to really maximize their use. A lot of communities lack local experts, and that's one of the things that REAP tries to work on around workforce development, and we'll be having some folks work with McGrath on that as well. And unfortunately, it can impact the power cost equalization aid. And so right now, how the formula works for that power cost equalization, which covers some communities' costs for electricity, then doesn't actually get calculated in and can actually reduce how much aid that the community can get. So making sure that you're doing it so that is not happening is really important, as well as, keeping that in mind as you're thinking about renewables. So, one too many slides. For microgrid development, as you're thinking about this, either creating a microgrid or, in most cases in Alaska, adding new projects onto a microgrid, there are 6 metrics that you want to consider as you're doing this. So safety, of course, is a huge one. Reliability, resilience, that it can withstand major events, sustainability, whether you're talking about the source of the energy or how sustainable the program or the project itself can keep itself going, cost effectiveness, and security. Now, unfortunately, you can't maximize all of these out to the highest level. There's always going to be trade-offs that need to happen. Something that is more sustainable or resilient might cost more. Same thing with like safety or reliability, tend to add cost to those sorts of things. But then there's always trade-offs on different areas. So this was they called a target diagram here that you could use to think about a project and how it fits in these different quadrants for these 6 metrics. So for example, I know one of the things that McGrath is looking at is solar. And one of the challenges is that McGrath tends to it has a lower voltage grid. And so with solar and low voltage grids, David Martinez, who I believe is online here as well, shared this chart for thinking about the problems associated with solar and low voltage, and then some of the solutions that you could actually use. So for example, solar can cause voltage variations. And so there is a solution having an inverter that would make sure that voltage is kept steady. So again, we're maintaining that frequency of the system so that it wouldn't be impacting the rest of the system. And again, the smaller the system, the more impact one type of one new thing can have an impact on that system. So the other thing we can have with low voltage systems, you also have increased cable losses. And this is a nice thing what solar inverters can also do, is limiting power output according to that grid, because that will help impact that as well. So you have that grade upgrades to make it more robust as part of that. All right, so that's our microgrid high-level overview. I think we're doing good. Not seeing any questions in the chat yet. I think we're hanging in there. All right, so on to our 3rd section of this presentation, is thinking about some of these specific clean energy technologies. And the first one that I always want to mention is efficiency. Efficiency first. The less energy that you have to use in general, of course.
Colleen, can you?
Yeah.
We need to ask you to pause.
Yeah.
So back there on your, was it on that chart, the low voltage chart? Okay, that low voltage grids and solar. We have some questions.
Okay. I can try to answer.
Do you think you could sort of explain it again?
Yeah, so McGrath has a low voltage grid. And so with a low voltage system, you tend to have increased cable losses, and any changes to that voltage, from what I understand, can then have a bigger impact on that frequency. And so of the grid, right? And so because the frequency needs to stay within that narrow range, as close to the 60 hertz as possible, adding in things like renewables like solar can have that bigger, can have a harder impact on that frequency. And so these are some of the things that David shared about with solar, adding solar on potentially, and using the correct solar inverters to minimize that impact. And so David, if you want to add anything else or correct anything I've said. Yeah.
Thanks, Colleen. And yeah, what you said is correct. And I would just like adding to what you were saying. We all know that solar produces electricity depending on the amount of sun the system is getting. So if a cloud passes by, or there are seasonal changes, or a bird is sitting on top of one panel and is shading partially the system, all that causes variations in the production. And these variations in the production can reflect variations also in the voltage that the grid itself experiences. So what modern inverters do is that they have a way to regulate the voltage. They have a way to regulate the power amount that is going out of the system. That is another of the topics that is mentioned in the table. For example, in McGrath, I heard in some of the meetings that the system already is at top capacity, right? So it's already holding as much energy as it can hold. So additional production or additional generation could overload the system. And what these inverters do is that you can add control to the inverter. So the amount of energy that is giving to the grid is always below that threshold that the grid has for capacity limits and stuff like that. So even though there are some problematics that can be derived from solar, the main objective of the table is just saying that there is always a solution. And I think also a grid upgrade for McGrath that requires like more electrical analysis and working around like really knowing exactly what's the system today, and then with the new considerations from solar or other generation sources, a design for the upgrades would be useful also. But yeah, I don't know if this clarifies what you were asking, Sarah, or if you have any other specific question or of the table.
We would probably, because we're at the highest capacity in our own system already, if we looked at solar, we would need to also look at battery storage. Is that right?
I think for your case, yes, it totally makes sense to have batteries and solar. The batteries would add some resiliency and they would add control to the grid itself, because they can receive excess energy and they can give energy when it's needed. So the batteries just gives you additional resiliency and additional flexibility to the system. It's not totally required, so you could only have PV with very good controls that limit the amount of PV that is going into the grid, and also the amount of generation that the diesel is the genset from diesel is generating. So you can choose, but in this case, I would totally say that the best option for McGrath is also consider batteries to have the additional benefits in the grid.
David, said another way, am I correct in saying when Colleen says that putting solar on or putting any renewable on a small grid, there's a significant impact and it comes in, how do you do that? How do you dispatch it? How do you control it? So the batteries, having the batteries is what mitigates that. Is that right?
Yes, the batteries mitigate a big part of it. And I'm saying that the PV itself can do a lot of the mitigation, and a lot of the controls can be added to the system only with the PV. But you are right when you're saying that adding the batteries gives you a more robust system, because then you have all the flexibility to take or give energy when you need it, and almost instantly, right? When you have PV, as Colleen was saying, you cannot just dispatch instantly whenever you want. You're like depending on the resource available. And with diesel, even though you can control the output, you have to wait a little bit of time. So the batteries give you that additional flexibility that is very useful in smaller grids.
Sarah, I just want to add also that McGrath Light and Power is looking, they are applying for a large grant to upgrade the capacity of their power lines. And they do have some, I don't know if they've identified specifically, but they do want to begin to incorporate renewable energy in their future planning. So upgrading those lines will change the picture.
Glad to hear that. Yep. And that's part of hopefully what the energy planning that you can do through the ETIPP program as well, as you start figuring that out. But glad to hear they're applying for that. Okay, other questions while we're here on this slide? On this? Okay.
We're good to go.
All right, great. So, moving on to some technologies. Of course, we're touched on some of this already, but that's great. Still good?
Hold on, Colleen, we have a question. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, this is all good, all this distribution and everything, but what we're gonna get power from?
That's what we're getting ready to talk about, right?
I couldn't hear the question.
I think we're ready to move on to looking at the different technologies and kind of where that technology is today.
Okay, great. Yep, so I do just, like I said, wanted to briefly start with efficiency because this is something that's not just about like switching out your light bulbs to LEDs, right? It's, you know, a big system-wide thing that you can think about. So there's, you know, efficiency that happens. There's always energy losses, right? Nothing can be 100% converted perfectly. You're always going to have some energy loss, but the less energy loss that you can have at each stage, the better, right? The more efficient that is. And so that's great. And so this is an image from National Academy of Sciences publication that they've put out. That's, for example, a coal power plant going to an incandescent light bulb. But what I wanted to show here is just that you always want to be thinking about these efficiencies, not just at the small scale, but at your larger scale in your grid, which it sounds like thinking about applying for those upgrades for the system is a great, fantastic start. And of course, there's a lot of pros to that where you're reducing costs. You need smaller systems. So if you're thinking about some sort of solar battery system, the more that you can be efficient or shifting when that energy is being used, the smaller systems that you need. Of course, you have all those other impacts, including improving air quality, more comfortable home, all of those things. Of course, many houses, it sounds like in McGrath, are already pretty energy efficient. And so those bigger changes are going to have much higher costs. So there is, you know, something you have to consider. It's not that every efficiency upgrade, if it's going to cost so much, kind of like the trade-offs we were talking about with microgrids, there's always some sort of trade-off there. So maximizing what that is, it's always important to consider. So jumping into some of our renewables, wind, I think, is pretty well known. I think about wind turbines, of course, converting the wind from the uneven heating of the earth into electricity. And there's a lot of pros to wind. So many places have a wind resource, at least somewhat. The technology is very mature. And so because of that, in conjunction, the cost has decreased rapidly. And a lot of places in the world, wind is actually the cheapest new energy resource that you can develop. And it can pair really well with a dispatchable resource. So for example, on Kodiak Island, they have wind and a pumped hydro. And so they can use their excess wind to pump hydro up and then use that hydro as a dispatchable resource. Of course, the cons is that it itself is not dispatchable. And so it's intermittent. It can be hard to predict exactly how much wind you'll have. It's, of course, still expensive to build in rural Alaska, even though the cost has come down. It's certainly not the cheapest in Alaska usually. And it does require a lot, or not a lot, but it does require maintenance. And so making sure that that is done properly and having the workforce able to do that maintenance is also a downside, and something that unfortunately we've seen all too often in rural Alaska are unmaintained turbines. But the systems are those technologies they have from, pretty small kilowatt systems that you would more see in smaller communities too. Here we have these are 1.2 megawatt systems on Fire Island to even huger, 10 megawatt offshore. So there's a wide variety of the sizes of wind turbines that are a mature technology, like I said. Now solar, we think about solar for electricity, so photovoltaic, but there are uses for thermal or heat use as well. But we'll focus, of course, on electricity for this, thinking about this. And the pros are it's abundant, right? We have a lot of solar resource in the state. And so we have, people often do if I'm not talking to people in Alaska, they'll think, oh, solar doesn't work in Alaska. It's like, well, actually, it works pretty well for more than half of the year. And it's really abundant, right? The sun will always come back at some point. It's always happening. Solar technology has no moving parts, so it really reduces that need for maintenance. It's a really mature technology. The price has also dropped drastically. It works in cold weather, especially, you're just doing a fixed system. Most places are not doing any tracking systems in Alaska. So it works really well. Cooler temperatures actually can improve solar production. And in places where you have snow on the ground in the springtime, you can actually have your best production in the spring, like March, April, potentially even into May, even though daylight is not as long because of the cooler temperatures, reflection off the snow, you can get really good solar production. Of course, it is intermittent, right? It's not something that is available all year round or even all day. And it's not dispatchable. It can't follow the load. So that's a big downside on solar. Now, when we think about hydro is always of interest in the state because a lot of places have water, right? Sometimes I tell people who don't live in Alaska that it feels like wherever there's not mountains, there's a swamp in Alaska. I spent a lot of time around the state. There's a lot of water here. So there's a lot of interest in hydro. How can we take advantage of all of that water? A lot of communities in the state, or a number of them, have taken advantage of that, such as Juneau, that produces basically 100% of its electricity from hydroelectric. And when we're thinking about this traditional hydro, we think about a dammed system. So either you as a man-made dam, an impoundment system, or taking advantage of natural dams, alpine lakes traditionally. You can think about, or you just divert part of your running water, and they call that sometimes run of the river as another way to do that. And it can be very efficient, and actually in the state can account for 20 to 30% of electricity generation of the state, because there are so many places that are using this. And it's dispatchable. It's a very mature technology. It's long lasting. There's systems that are more than 100 years old that are still producing electricity, of course, with maintenance. But it is very expensive to build and install. To actually make that happen, there is a very lengthy process with permitting, making sure you're reducing impacts on the environment. Traditional impoundment dams, you're going to have a very major impact on the environment. So we definitely don't see those very often in Alaska. People are more interested in lake tap or diverted systems so that you don't have that impact from your kind of dams or your impoundment systems of hydro. And then there's also hydrokinetic. So go back a slide here. Whereas traditional hydro is falling water. So either you're creating the fall through a turbine that generates electricity, or you're taking advantage of a natural change in elevation, like at a waterfall, or like I said, alpine lake tap system. With hydrokinetic, you're using flowing water. So you don't have that drop, or what they call the head of that energy. And there's pros to that, because you have less impact on the environment if you're not, creating some sort of dam that way. And you have it's usable, like pretty much anywhere you have moving water, depending on your system. Can be very predictable production. You can have sensors that tell you how much this, like a river is flowing, or if it's a tidal system also falls into this hydrokinetic, then when the tides are going to happen and how big the tides are going to be. So it's very predictable, but it may only be available seasonally, right? Like our creeks and rivers freeze most of the time in the winter. Sometimes they don't freeze all the way down, so you can take advantage of that. It's also not a mature technology. It's still being tested. There's many different systems that are still trying to be figured out, and that are going to be different from location to location, what will work well depending on the type of water and river or creek or whatever it is that you're trying to take advantage of. And so if they're not quite commercially available, like say wind turbines are, they've kind of converged on one system that works really well with the 3 blades, aerodynamic blades. We're not quite there yet with this hydrokinetic systems. And it's still going to be a while before we get there. So those are the main renewable energy systems that I wanted to talk about. And then I also wanted to mention electrification, because this is a big talking point that we hear about in sustainability. And so electrification means that you're upgrading a fossil fuel powered appliance or item with an efficient electric one that, of course, you can have an electric version, may not be more efficient. So typically we think about this as something that is more efficient. And so we see this in, for example, space heating. So these are like, this is picture is an air source heat pump. Can also have water heating, like an on-demand system, or they make water heat pumps as well. Induction cook stoves, so not like your resistance electric cooktop stoves, but the induction style. You have them for dryers, of course, electric vehicles. And so a lot of the pros here is that you're reducing your overall fossil fuel use and usually your overall energy costs. For example, driving an electric vehicle is a lot cheaper than driving a internal combustion vehicle. The electricity tends to be cheaper and more efficient, so you're overall using less energy, less air pollution. There's a lot of tax rebates and other incentives that are coming for this electrification. But of course, they're very expensive upfront costs. I don't have it listed here, but another important one, con to this, is that a lot of systems may not be ready for this electrification. So they don't have, if a grid isn't able to accept more electricity draw, or the higher draw, because it, like an electric vehicle or a heat pump uses similar plugins to like a welder or an electric dryer. And so that's a lot of electricity that gets pulled at once. So if it's not set up for that, that can be hard on a grid. And heat pumps in Alaska, which are one of the most popular ones that you see in Alaska going in, especially like in Southeast Alaska. Clay could talk about that for days, I'm sure. You still generally need some sort of backup heating system. So it's not like you can completely replace your heating system. So a lot of pros and cons to electrification as well, but electrification does pair well. We typically think about that in terms of renewables, because as you switch more things to electric, and as you turn your electric grid to be more renewable, and what I should say actually is back up for a second, is say that it's easier to have electricity come from more renewable resources. Not easy, right? Let's say it's easy, but it tends to be easier to have your electric grid become more renewable than say your heating system to be straight from a renewable source. So that is one of the benefits, is that it can pair well with renewables. Okay, so one of my last technology slide here is thinking about energy storage. So as David mentioned, having storage sounds like it's probably a good thing for McGrath to consider. And there's a lot of different types of storage technologies. And this came from a great presentation that I found from Dr. Stan Atsedy of Sandia National Labs. And so if you guys want to look at this more, Introduction to Microgrids and Energy Storage, there's a PDF of his presentation that's freely available online that you can find more about this as well. But I really liked this slide that he had that was showing kind of an overview of the different types of energy storage that is available for grids. So we have, everything from our batteries to typically think about, and fuel cells like hydrogen, to thermal energy storage, mechanical compressed air storage. I've been hearing more about that flywheel, which is something that Kodiak uses. And so the ones that are most mature, at least that I'm aware of, from what I have kind of understood, are things like the pumped hydro, the flywheel style that, like I mentioned, Kodiak uses, and then rechargeable batteries. So we typically think of these as like our lithium ion, lead acid type of batteries. And those are the ones that are mature technologies. Their prices have come down quite a bit more. Not that these others aren't there, but typically you want to be looking for these, technologies that are going to have a really strong track record for use in different areas. Okay. So that was my brief overview of technologies. Just a couple more slides here, and then we can get into some more questions and discussions. And there's a lot, like I said, I drew from a lot of resources, and I tried to, some of this is simplified, of course, but I wanted to try to make sure that we had this kind of nice overview of thinking about grids and microgrids. And what I really encourage is, if you really want to dig into especially microgrids more, there's this online Foundations of Microgrid course that Alaska Center for Energy and Power developed that is available on this platform called edX. So it's available online. I've gone through it on my computer, but apparently it's also very mobile friendly. So like you can download modules onto your phone, and where you do have some internet, and then take it home to be able to use it where you don't necessarily have good internet. So that one is a longer course. Like there's 4 big modules that you can go through on that, and you can audit it completely free. It's for 4 weeks. It's available for you for a month. If you are interested in having access to this course for a longer time, ACEP said that they can get some codes for you to be able to do basically the paid version that without paying for it. But the paid version allows you to have access to it for much longer. And so kind of the next run, you can sign up for the course anytime, any day. They kind of have them set up where they run in blocks of different groups of people. And so kind of the next block that they are starting is here in just over a week. So if you're interested in doing the paid version, let Haley know. She's going to collect names, and we can get you codes for that as well by next Friday. And then the other thing, a much shorter version, but also a really nice dive, is Dr. Daisy Huang did this great presentation called Renewable Energy Implementation in Alaska Islanded Microgrids. So there you go, right here, really digging into that specific topic. And that is available to watch on YouTube. I think it's just over an hour long, and it was just from 2.5 years ago. So it's still, really relevant. And Daisy is a great resource in general anyway. And then if you want more kind of general information about sustainability, also recommend UAF Bristol Bay campus through their sustainable energy program has a lot of online classes. And I've taken a lot of their classes before I knew a lot about energy. It really helped me get started. And that's a great place. They currently have resources to help pay for the cost of the credit, or you can audit courses from them. So then the last slide that I have, so I'm going to let Haley talk about this briefly, and then we can have some more conversation. I'm sure there's questions about some of the other stuff that we have here about the future work that REAP is doing with McGrath through the ETIPP project.
Thanks so much, Colleen. It's been such a great session. So I hope everyone's enjoying it and learning something. I just wanted to follow up with a couple of the other sessions that are going to come up. So we have 5 sessions in this energy education task for ETIPP. And so today we checked off Energy 101. The next session, we'll have Tyler Katzmar, as well as myself and Rob and a couple other folks coming to McGrath in August, ideally the 1st through the 4th. And there'll be some kids sessions that are really hands-on, as well as adult sessions. So mark your calendars for that chunk of time to invite your friends and family and community. We'll have a lot more information. And then session 3 is going to be Rob talking to energy decision makers in the community, helping figure out what what considerations to take into account when making decisions about your energy. And then that will be maybe in person, probably maybe virtual. And then more community-wide sessions are renewable energy and energy efficiency workforce, which will happen in early November, which will be virtual, just like this one. And then lastly, funding 101, that will happen early December, about what are some of the options available right now to fund some of the renewable energy plans, community energy plans that we all developed together. So yeah, mark your calendars and hopefully we'll see you again at one of our future sessions.
All right, actually unmute myself. There we go. I just want to say thank you. Go ahead, and that seems like it's went to the end there. What questions do we have lingering? What else would you like to know? Yes, Matthias.
Hello, and thank you for the updated information. I have two main questions, and the first one is you talk about grid and central energy production. Is there a reason why you don't talk about individual energy production? Is it not efficient? Is it just out of your scope, or is it proven that the local grid is better and more efficient than individual energy production?
Great question. Thank you. Yeah, so in this case, I was asked to talk about microgrids and grids particularly. And so that's why I focused on that. But individual energy production is also very important. They call it like distributed energy resources is one way to think about it. Residential energy use. There's a lot of ways to be looking at that. Virtual power plants is another fun one to dive into. And so in this case, I just didn't touch on to it, but it is an important part of thinking about total energy production. I think, does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to know if it was not like state of the art was already stating that an individual production is not efficient or something like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have another question I can ask maybe yet. I feel that I don't hear about energy saving, and it's not regarding your presentation in particular, but I feel that when we talk about sustainable energy production and alternatives, we just consider 50% of the global topic, and I regret that we don't talk about energy saving in Alaska, which for me is in a rural community, because for me it's like 50% of the effort should be on energy saving. So I know maybe it's not capitalistic enough or something like that, but I wanted to know if it's the scope of your work group or initiative, or if there is other entities that address that in Alaska.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, a lot of my education outreach, the primary goal of my work is actually all around efficiency. And so like I have a whole curriculum written for K through 12 that I share with teachers that is specifically on efficiency and using less energy. It was just in this case, I was told that McGrath residents are already pretty darn energy efficient. And so I didn't need to be diving into a bunch of tips on necessarily that efficiency. And Rob's jumping in here before I put my foot too far in my mouth, I suppose.
No, you've done no such thing. Yeah, energy efficiency and conservation are significant components of any planning process, right? The way that we conceptualize it is as a megawatt. So when you're thinking about grid planning, when you're thinking about meeting energy needs, anything that you can do that actually reduces the number of kilowatts in the instance of McGrath significantly changes the available technologies, for instance, and also addresses the scale of technology. So it's a significant component, and I think it would be a component of any part of the community energy planning process. But again, we started from, and you have to understand that we work across the state, and when we looked at the consumption data, the energy consumption data for the community of McGrath, the first thing that we were surprised about was how little electricity community members use in McGrath relative to other communities. So that was the reason for our focus. But I think only a fool ignores the potential for conservation and efficiency technologies in your planning. And actually, not only does McGrath utilize at a homeowner, at an individual residential customer level, do they have a significant, are they really monitoring their energy consumption relative to others? One of the things that the community has taken advantage of, a great energy efficiency technology, is a heat recovery system. And you have a heat recovery loop that provides buildings throughout the community with very low cost heat that would otherwise just be a wasted byproduct of the production of electricity. The last time I ran the numbers on it, it was the equivalent of about $2.25 per gallon heating fuel oil cost, which of course we know the heating fuel costs in McGrath are significantly higher than that. Okay, I saw there were some other questions. Do we want to get to some other questions that we've got?
Yeah, we have some questions in the room there.
I have a question about the PCE. You said that the renewables impact PCE, so I guess it means that they don't fit into the formula, and that means we would be penalized on PCE if we were doing a lot of renewables. Can you explain that some more? And is there anything being done to change the regulations to make to encourage, well, to get rid of that discouragement?
Rob, can you tackle this one?
Yeah, I sure can. Yeah. So the issue really has to do with the way that the buy down is provided in the PCE formula. So what I want to say is that if you produce energy less expensively, electricity less expensively in McGrath, any customers that are not currently getting the PCE benefit, which might include the AC store, and might include, I think your roadhouse might be included, the school, they will all benefit directly, right? Like it'll just show up as, it would likely show up as either a reduction in their cost of electricity on a kilowatt hour basis, or what is more likely, just a lack of increases over time. For the individual residential consumer, what can happen is it can actually, it has proven to not buy down the cost of electricity to the residential consumer at the same rate as the commercial consumer. Now, there is a workaround. There's a way around this that many communities have taken advantage of, which is to establish an independent power producer, that what's called an IPP. And the independent power producer owns the assets, so let's say solar panels or wind turbines, and they then sell that electricity to the utility. If they sell that electricity to the utility, that penalty is not applied to the consumer because it shows up as purchased power. So there are definitely ways around that. And that method, one of the things that we're still trying to get worked out, and I think we eventually will, is where community members in McGrath will get to talk with Ingemar Mathiasen from the Northwest Arctic Borough. He and a number of communities that he works in have figured out how to set up these nonprofit independent power producers that produce energy using renewable energy systems and haven't had that impact on ratepayers, effectively lowering their subsidy. So there's definitely a way to do that that can impact that. In terms of anything that's before the Regulatory Commission of Alaska that might significantly alter that. I haven't seen it, and I haven't seen a bill in the legislature that would address that. And I think, quite honestly, there's concern with an endowment like the PCE endowment, which is more than $1 billion. I think that there's a concern that anytime you open up debate about changing the rules of operation, that there might be unfavorable changes. Essentially, there just aren't enough rural Alaska legislators that would be able to make sure that you got that specific benefit to the customer. And the concern might be that that there might be changes that would be less favorable to rural Alaskans. I wish the climate weren't such that that was a consideration, but I think it always is.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rob. You described that much better than I could have.
I think the primary takeaway here is that that you can purchase or get grant funded renewable energy generation technologies and deploy them on the grid without impacting ratepayers that receive PCE, which I think is what my concern is for McGrath, and I'm sure for ratepayers would be a concern.
Other questions?
I pretty much Alaska, you know, Alaska, located on. There's not commercially available technology to such a steady, reliable source of energy.
I couldn't hear that question. Would somebody mind re-saying it closer to the speaker?
You didn't hear my question? Well,
no. Yeah, I couldn't.
Hydrokinetic because there's so much water everywhere. Why isn't it more advanced in Alaska?
Oh, why isn't it more advanced?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is just the number of years. Oh, sorry. The question is, why is hydrokinetic not more advanced in Alaska?
yes,
Okay,
yes.
okay. I don't know that I have a great answer for that, other than just it hasn't been around as long. So people didn't start developing it or really working on it on like this larger community scale until, I don't know how long ago, Rob, 10, 15 years ago that people really started working on it. Whereas other technologies have been around for, you know, like wind 40 or 50 years or longer, if you want to think about windmills, right? Or solar that's been, you know, started NASA in like the 50s, I think. So it just, people didn't start working on it until then, and it just takes time.
And there are also, if I could jump in, Colleen, there are challenges that you have for hydrokinetic systems that you wouldn't have with other renewable energy generation systems that you know that are particularly problematic. The issue of turbidity in water is a significant issue for hydrokinetic systems, and then somebody has got to figure out how you deal with all those doggone big trees that come down the river, and even in communities where we have relatively clear water hydrokinetic systems, they're having significant problems with things as simple as keeping grass and algae out of the foils, which is sort of shocking that you'd have that many millions of dollars of of R&D invested in that, and something as relatively inconsequential as that are impactful. I think the other part of it is it's just a matter of money. And the technologies tend to favor those that can produce energy for larger customer bases than smaller customer bases. And I think most of what we're seeing in terms of hydrokinetic generation development is focused at smaller customer bases, which just means that there's just less money that can be spent on research and development. And the end technology is just going to be less expensive. So I think some of it has just been the economics of just the economics in terms of supply and demand and scale that's available for these technologies.
Yeah, hey Rob, I can speak to the
Yeah.
challenges you were talking about. I worked at the Nenana test site for grad school and did some testing on a turbine. And we had some chains that were dangling in the water with some coating. And by the end of our 3-week test period, it stripped the coating completely off due to how turbid the water is. We had our debris diverter, we had several tree strikes. It's just a really, really challenging environment to deploy anything in. By the end of the testing, our turbine was pretty well plugged up with silt. It's just like you said, it's really tricky.
Yeah, thanks, Elon. Feel free to jump in anytime.
Somewhere
Sorry, could you say that again? Couldn't hear you.
several different attempts or methods being tried somewhere in Alaska, maybe on the river or Yukon River or somewhere up there.
Experimental. Eagle or something.
Did you catch that, Rob?
Yeah, I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
So
What's your question?
are
Yes.
you guys up to speed with the work that the University of Alaska is doing on any of these generators? Are you aware of all their projects or some of the projects?
Where the
Do you work
project,
with them?
yeah, with the university, like Alaska Center for Energy and Power on their research? Or what?
Yeah, that's it.
What?
Yeah.
Alaska Center for Energy and Power at the university.
Yeah. Well, they've been working on this for 30 years. I think they have a demonstration project somewhere out ahead of the Yukon or somewhere. Of
Well, that's what
underwater.
so that's what Elon was talking about, is that he was working for, he was interning with.
Yeah, I was working for AHERC, which is under ACEP.
And we have, one of the things that we're regularly doing, the ETIPP team is doing, is we're meeting with ACEP and specifically the Marine Technologies Group to keep them up to speed on what developments we're having, but also we're working behind the scenes with them to try and identify funding for instrumentation deployment in McGrath specifically. We're looking at solar, but as well as hydrokinetic as well. So yeah, we're working with them quite a bit, and we're quite familiar with the technologies and where their projects are.
It answered your question.
It got noisy in here, Rob, and we kind of missed some of that, but you were talking about our request for the teamer grant.
Yeah. So we're working specifically with ACEP to get McGrath a teamer grant to deploy instrumentation in the Kuskokwim River to get a sense of and to begin modeling the potential for installation of a hydrokinetic device somewhere around McGrath. So we're working on that. We meet with them at least once a month about those efforts to continue pushing forward hydrokinetic generation in McGrath.
So Rob, we were looking, when we first talked to ASEP or recently talked to ASEP about that, we were looking at like maybe a 2-year, looking sort of down the road at maybe 2 years before something would actually happen on the, I wouldn't say on the ground, but in the river here. Is that still the idea? And
Yeah,
what do we as a community?
Sorry, Sarah.
What do we as a community need? Yeah.
Yeah, so I spoke to Ben earlier this week, Ben Leffler, and he was consistent. He was consistent with that estimate. In terms of what you can do to continue to advance those efforts is take the long view and really take this community energy planning effort very seriously. And one of the things that we're really going to work hard with McGrath on is developing a statement of need or a problem statement. And we're going to work on developing that in multiple formats, you know, something that's a little longer format that would be written, all the way down to something that if Sarah has an opportunity to meet somebody who's looking to fund projects, she can give them a 30-second elevator speech and we can figure out if there's alignment there. I think that research has shown and best practices dictate that that's really where it's at, is understanding what your problem is and being able to communicate that. So there's that. The other thing that I think you will all really enjoy is what we're planning in December, the Funding 101 training. We will talk about best practices there, but it is my intent to bring funders to that training. So entities that are looking to fund these kinds of projects will be there to talk with you. And they're all fairly excited about that opportunity.
That's really what we want to hear, and you know that very well because I've told you many times that that's what this community, we want to be a part of the research. We are surrounded on 3 sides by water. It only makes sense, and it's been talked about for so many years that people are almost kind of getting tired of it. But by this training today, to look at our information, maturity of the resource or the maturity of the technology, and we see that hydrokinetic is still not commercially available for something that would apply to our type of river system for sure, that we want to be part of that. We want to be in there, and we are, and it sounds like we are.
Yeah. Thank you for that explanation. Thank you for being willing to come out here and get the funding.
But we're almost at 3, so I want to respect people's time. Thank Colleen for a great presentation. You can definitely email me with any further questions. My email is hreed@realaska.org, and I'll send out an email following up with some of the resources like the University of Alaska Fairbanks, my Intro to Microgrids course. Just a reminder, if you want a full access code to take that 4-module course, is kind of an introduction to microgrids, please reach out to me and I can get you a code for that. Also, Sarah, if you wouldn't mind getting me a list of all of the people who were here in person, just kind of write their names down and shoot me an email, that would be amazing. And I wanted everyone maybe thank Colleen in person or on the call for a really great intro to microgrids. Whew. Thanks so much for coming, everyone.
Had a lot of help from a lot of people getting that together, so appreciate it. Yeah, and I'm happy to send the slides with all the pictures and stuff on it to you, Sarah, if you want that.
And Sarah, you've got my number. Actually, I think most of you have my number, my email address. Call, email anytime. I'm happy to talk to any of you over the phone, which I think sometimes can be easier. And when we're in town in August, we will talk to any and all comers that want to chat. And yeah, and if we think it makes sense for me to come back in October, I'll come back in October as well and have all the conversations you guys want to have.
Sounds good.
Thanks,
Great.
everybody. Thanks for the great questions. I hope you guys have a great rest of your summer.
You too. Thank you.
See you, everyone. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.